Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Brookings webinar on Super Tuesday. I'm Elaine Kamarck, Senior Fellow here at Brookings, and for purposes of the discussion today, I'm also the author of Primary Politics, Everything You Need to Know About How America Nominates Its Presidential Candidates. With me today, I have three seasoned political analysts. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. First, we have Christopher Cadelago. He is the California Bureau Chief for Politico. Before that, he covered the White House for Obama and Biden for Politico, as well as covering the Biden and Harris campaign. And he's worked at the Sacramento Bee and a variety of other California newspapers. So, Christopher, welcome to Brookings. Next, we have Bill Christopher. He is a leading American conservative writer. He was founder and editor of the Weekly Standard, and he recently joined The Bulwark as editor-at-large. He's the author of many books and articles and a much sought-after speaker and TV commentator. Finally, last but least, is Gabriel Sanchez. He is my colleague here at the Brookings Institution, as well as a professor at the University of New Mexico. He specializes in Hispanic politics and in doing some polling, and he is the author of a forthcoming book, Latino Politics in America, Community, Culture, and Interests. So I'm going to take the prerogative as moderator and start today's discussion with a little history of Super Tuesday. It owes its creation to President Jimmy Carter. Carter was the second Democratic nominee to win under the new reformed rules and the first one to become president. Unlike other politicians of his day, he understood that in the new system, sequence mattered. It was a sequence of contests, not one. At the same time, both political parties were trying to figure out how to keep the nomination season from running into the fall or Christmas of the year before. So they adopted rules saying when their states could begin to hold primaries, early March, and they carved out exceptions for traditionally early states like Iowa and New Hampshire. So in the run-up to Jimmy Carter's re-election campaign in 1980, his campaign used their influence from the White House to move as many southern states as possible early in the season. And the idea was that if a lot of southern states happened early on, he could build up a delegate lead, which would hold him in good stead against any challenger. At the time they were doing this, they thought the challenger would be Jerry Brown. It turned out that Governor Jerry Brown, it turned out that his most formidable challenger ended up being Senator Ed Kennedy, but that's the way these things go. So as the 1980 nomination race began, Super Tuesday had a definite Southern accent. By 1988, the Southern accent was even stronger, as moderates in the Democratic Party, led by the Democratic Leadership Council, tried to create a calendar that would produce more moderate candidates for the Democrats. In fact, it didn't work out that way. The Democrats nominated Michael Dukakis, but it just goes to show how these things never quite work out the way people think. Nonetheless, for a time, Super Tuesday was known as the SEC primary after the Southeastern Conference for college sports. As the new rules in nomination politics took hold, states came to understand that being early made you important. So over the years, more and more states moved to Super Tuesday, creating more of a national primary. Minnesota, Massachusetts, and California joined southern states on Super Tuesday. And this year's Super Tuesday, while not the SEC primary anymore, still has a southern accent to it, with 7 states from the South, if you include Oklahoma, composing a little bit less than half of the states that we heard from yesterday. States do come in and out of Super Tuesday, but it remains the first big delegate day of the nomination season, which is why it is so important and attracts so much attention. So with that, let's go to a discussion of what happened yesterday. And I want to start with Bill Kristol and ask Bill, hey, what are we to make of Nikki Haley's showing last night? And what do you think she's going to do next?
Good to be with you all. I voted for Nikki Haley in Northern Virginia, and I'm glad to say that she carried my little precinct in McLean by better than 2-1. So I can still go to the Giant, and not be harassed or shunned by all my fellow Northern Virginians. But she didn't carry it. Virginia, which seemed like a state where she might have a real shot, she lost almost 2-1, and basically she lost. She did well against Trump because it's Trump's party, and he's now being renominated for the third time in a row, something that does not happen very often in American politics. I was running my mind over this. I mean, Nixon had 3 nominations, but not sequential. FDR, obviously. But I think no one else, and I don't know. I mean, I guess Grover Cleveland, I guess, in the late 19th century. I mean, the degree of Trump's control of the party was really shown last night. Haley was running a good campaign. I think picked up most of the, non-Trump enthusiastic and non-Trump acquiescent votes, ended up getting 25, 30, 34 in most of the states. Sort of depends on whether there were open primaries or not, and obviously on the character of the Republican Party in these different states. And she suspended her campaign this morning. So last one standing. All these, those of us who've been involved in the anti-Trump efforts had many excuses for why it didn't quite work out. The field was fractured. We never got a one-on-one race. Well, got a one-on-one race this time with a good candidate, really, and someone who could appeal to pretty much the entire swath of the Republican Party. She's not too liberal on social issues for Republicans. She was a governor of a Republican state, ambassador to the UN, and appropriately tough on Iran and foreign policy and so forth. And still, at the end of the day, the party wanted Trump. The party got Trump. Governor Haley pulled out this morning and did not endorse Trump. I think that's the biggest story of the last 6 weeks. Will turn out to have been the dynamic of the Haley campaign itself, which pushed her to be a more radical critic of Trump, as I would put it, than she certainly was in those debates last year on the stage, where she raised her hand to say she would endorse Trump, and where she was very much pulling her punches against Trump, except for some vague stuff about how it's a little chaotic when he's around. She really took him on NATO and Putin. She took him on even on January 6th at the end, which has been sort of territory you can't go into if you're a Republican, apparently, and on some other issues as well. So it's interesting. I mean, you've been through this, Elaine, others too. I mean, I'll just say a word on this and stop. These campaigns do have a dynamic of their own, right? I mean, she didn't start off intending to be where, or expecting to be where she is today, I think. And I give her credit, really, in a way, for internalizing that dynamic. And I think also dealing with Trump wasn't pleasant. So, and Trump's people, so that probably radicalized her a little. It reminds me a little, I was just a kid then, but Gene McCarthy, was not a big new left youth power person in 1967. He was a slightly diffident Catholic, anti-war, but, sort of senator from Minnesota. Hubert Humphrey was the great liberal hope in Minnesota, not a champion in Minnesota, not McCarthy. And the dynamic of that campaign made McCarthy much more radical in a sense, and much more the embodiment of a certain movement almost than he's intended to be or started out to be. I think the big question now for Haley is how much she embraces that. She might not. She might take a month or two off, maybe end up endorsing, maybe not endorse, maybe just say a sentence about I support the ticket and go, not, stay out of it, keep her powder dry for 2028. Or does she, as she sort of suggested this morning in her remarks, think she has a role to play in 2024? And she's going to continue to criticize Joe Biden, and she apparently can't imagine supporting Biden. But obviously, the bulk of what she's done so far is to criticize Trump. But would she keep doing that in a general election campaign? Are there third party or independent candidates she could support? I think she's a big unknown factor in this race. Biden and Trump are not unknown, and it's the first time in over a century we've had a president and the most recent president running against each other. So they're like, this is a rerun. This is a rerun with one new thing in it, basically, at this point, which is Nikki Haley. And that makes her a very interesting and potentially, I think, kind of important figure, even though in terms of actual votes, she's not in Biden or Trump's class so far, obviously.
Well, and Bill, I was thinking today, I can't remember a Super Tuesday where the outcome so clearly identified all the places on election day that both candidates were going to have to pay attention to. I mean, Joe Biden came out this morning praising Nikki Haley and saying nice things about Nikki Haley. He clearly was looking at all those places in all those swing states that she won and saying, okay, I want to talk to those people. and report. Trump did not do that. Trump is not big on being gracious, as we now know. Nonetheless, his campaign is reported as being focused like a laser on the places where Nikki Haley won, obviously hoping that they will come back to the party. And I don't remember any Super Tuesday giving us this kind of a path to November.
But also, don't you think, I don't remember too many Super Tuesdays just ending the race. I mean, usually they are determinative,
Yeah.
in retrospect, or very indicative of where it's going, and the person who wins the most states there, ends up winning the nomination, Clinton and stuff. But this time it's really over in both parties, and never was that not over. So it's a very unusual situation. Two, 81-year-old and 77-year-old who are having a rerun race, which the country doesn't really want, but it seems now we're going to have 8 months of it. And I feel like that's sort of unsustainable, but I could be wrong about that. Probably am wrong about that. But I don't know. And then Haley is kind of a wild card. It's an interesting, unusual moment. It makes you wonder how much all the rules we've learned about campaigns and how they've worked in the past will hold in this one, because it's just very different. We haven't had
Exactly.
We haven't had the age situation. We haven't had, Trump is unique in his own way in many ways. I feel like I'm both, like we're all political junkies here, and so we're all thinking what analogy to this and to that, and I think that's all fair enough and important. But I also wonder how much this one's going to look like previous ones. Are there going to be debates? Just a million obvious questions. Could there be a serious third party, et cetera?
Gabe, let's go to you next. And I want to ask you, what did you see in the Democratic primary results? In Michigan last week, we saw a significant protest vote. Did you see anything last night that looks like that may continue?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine, for putting this together and inviting me to be on this panel. One quick note on Haley, which was obviously the big news of the evening. I can't do much more than my colleague has already said, but she's obviously in a super powerful position to potentially swing the election outcome based on whether she makes an endorsement, how she maneuvers. And you saw both candidates, obviously Biden much more aggressively than Trump, make a case to her and the voters that supported her that they should move in their direction. And I would expect much more of this aggressively and strategically courting that really critical vote. My 2 cents is I would expect her to take a bit of a middle of the road approach, not endorsing either candidate, but noting that she plans to vote for the GOP like she always has in the past, kind of playing it safe and down the middle. And the big picture take-home message is, with Haley out of the race, Trump now can focus on the general election and mostly focus his resources, right? The war chest that he has specifically, on Biden in the general election. So that was the big news. But on the Democratic side, we did see some mixed evidence of a protest, or some are calling it the non-committed vote, across Super Tuesday states where this was an option for voters. Keep in mind, not all voters have the opportunity to express their opinion in that way. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. But although we did not see evidence, as you noted, of a very strong and organized effort of the same magnitude that we saw in Michigan, with, just for some context, right, just over 100,000 voters in Michigan filed what often is referred to as a protest vote. So we didn't see that magnitude, but we did see, unfortunately for the Biden administration, meaningful numbers of voters choose to take this route, which is obviously troubling for the Biden administration, given how tight the race is projected to be. And in some of these states where the vote margin back in 2020 were in range of these voters having an impact, is definitely a concern for them. The state that I like to pinpoint as an example of this is Minnesota, where folks might have saw, roughly 46,000, that's roughly 19% of the vote, were in this, protest vote situation, a non-committed vote situation, which, at least in terms of the on-the-ground effort and what we saw from the numbers, is the closest we saw on Super Tuesday states to what we saw in Michigan. The New York Times had a breakout of some exit poll data from Minnesota, which is important because it gives us some indication of who these folks are. And I think what's troubling for the Biden administration, it was a coalition of not just Muslim American voters, which was what we saw primarily in Michigan, but also young progressive voters, which is obviously key for the Biden administration. They've got to see not just a high vote share among young voters, but they've got to see turnout and enthusiasm at high levels to see a path for victory for Biden. So that was troubling, if you will. Other states, North Carolina, big numbers in terms of overall votes. I think it was 88,000 what I saw late last night. much smaller in terms of percentage of the vote. You also saw Massachusetts about 9%, Colorado 8%. So you saw this again, not at the same magnitude, but if this holds up through election day, it obviously poses a pretty significant challenge for Biden as, again, the vote margins in some of these key states, North Carolina and Michigan being two of the key battleground states, right? Obviously, any significant shift to what we saw in 2020 could jeopardize re-election for the Biden administration. However, all that being said, I don't anticipate this being the big challenge for Biden in November, and primarily because so much has happened in the political world since the 2020 primary. It's very easy to forget that we had a lot of similar concerns about enthusiasm for Biden back then as we do now. Back then, folks might forget about all of this, but it was really a question of whether or not Bernie Sanders supporters would galvanize around Biden, support the Democratic ticket. All of that seems like light years ago. But at the end of the day, right, Democratic voters coalesced around Biden, turned out at the numbers that they needed to see, him eventually emerge as the victor. And so there's a lot of parallels to what we see now. Finally, on this point, right, let's not forget that if former President Trump continues to message around things like the Muslim immigration ban, it would be very hard for me to imagine this group of non-committed voters not eventually coalescing around Biden to prevent a Trump victory. So a lot of reason for the Biden team to be worried, but I think big picture, a lot of this looks similar to what we saw in terms of the early numbers around enthusiasm concerns for Biden back then.
Boy, and the two of you have really given us the, $100,000 question here, which is, are these voters coming home? Are the Haley voters coming home? Are these uncommitted, small as they are, coming home? And I think it's useful to remind the audience that the Haley numbers are very small. The uncommitted numbers are very small, but they are, in some instances, bigger than the margins that happened in 2020. So let me give you an example that I called up earlier in the day. Trump's margin in North Carolina in 2020 was 74,483 votes. The Haley vote was 249,651. Now, as Bill alluded to earlier, some of those might be Democrats who were thinking, who basically were never going to vote for a Republican and just decided that Haley was the lesser of two evils. But to the extent that some of them are really never Trumpers and they've just had it with Donald Trump, that could be easily the margin in a really very, very close state, as were several others. Let's see, Chris, let's go to you. In some ways, the down ballot races on Tuesday were more interesting than the top of the ticket, just because we knew what was going to happen. Can you tell us a little bit about what you saw in California, maybe what you saw in North Carolina, and what you think this means for the fall?
Yeah, I think not only the outcomes of these down ballot races, but also what we saw in the voter turnout in some of these races. And just to start with California, we had a Senate race here to fill the seat permanently of the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. And that was a race that featured 3 House members, pretty well known from California, in some cases very well known, folks like Adam Schiff, Katie Porter, the Congresswoman from Orange County. And there was some maneuvering there. Schiff spent a lot of money to promote in this open top 2 jungle primary the Republican to give himself an easy ride into November. But that electorate, and part of the reason that was possible is because based on the early mail returns, which are tracked by, you can look at age bands, you can look at who's voting. It was a far older electorate. It was a very low turnout, especially for a presidential primary, in large part because of what Bill spoke about, which is this repeat presidential. If you had a scenario where there was a Bernie Sanders on the ballot, you might have seen a different outcome there. And there was also kind of warnings in other states, potentially even some upside for Biden, North Carolina being a real example, in the governor's race there, where Mark Robinson, who's, had a litany of anti-Semitic comments, just has really been out there, potentially putting that state on the map for Biden in a way that may not have been the case before. You talk about Georgia, you talk about these other stretches for the Democrats to pick up some of these states. North Carolina could move in one direction to the, far right, so to speak, or even in a very Republican direction with kind of a trifecta with its legislature and governor, or it could really go the other way. The Democratic Attorney General there, Josh Stein, is popular, and it could give sort of a foothold for Biden to spend some money this time around and really play in North Carolina in a way that, hasn't happened since Obama, frankly. And so that's a really interesting one. And then just in some of the other down ticket races, there were some upsides for Democrats in a state like California, and New York, as this audience very well knows, will be seminal to helping determine whether Democrats can retake the House. And you had a number of situations where it was possible in this strange top two system where outcomes can knock out a leading Democrat and promote two Republicans, and in that case, it would take that seat off the map and make it not competitive. And Democrats basically avoided those sort of doomsday scenarios, and so they came out of the state, at least in California, with a pretty good night. But I think this low turnout, we'll see. Whether things sort of revert back in this general election environment, but there's a real warning there. The other thing I'd mention is we're trying to quantify what are these, protests, these Palestinian protests, the ceasefire protests over Gaza really mean in terms of turnout. And just looking at the young vote, looking at the types of folks that have been protesting in states like a lot of blue states, frankly, New York, California, that certainly did not translate either to the more progressive early ceasefire call candidates. And it certainly does not look like it's translated in the number of turnout. And so when we look at the concern among Democrats and the concern in some of these other states for folks not turning out for Biden, I think the question will be, do these folks obviously come back home to Biden? Do they just not vote? And there were some kind of clues in what we saw in the Super Tuesday turnout, at least in California, showing that it was, the percentage of folks, I think it's 18 to 35 and then 45 and older, are roughly equal. And the turnout among the senior population, so to speak, so over, well over 45, was many multiples higher than the younger turnout. And so that's really the big takeaway from California.
That's so interesting because, of course, one of the other huge questions is, was that Michigan turnout for uncommitted, was that a function of the fact that Michigan, more than any other state, has high concentrations of Arab Americans, or was it a premonition of things to come? And there wasn't a lot of time between Michigan and Super Tuesday for uncommitted to get organized. Apparently, the people who organized in Michigan are trying to organize it in other states. But so, was this a function of no time? Or is it simply unique to Michigan? And I think that's the interesting question that you raised. Okay, listen, I have another question now for absolutely everybody, which is, what do you think is going to happen in the next series of primaries? Will they tell us anything, or with Haley out of the race, are these going to be non-events that we just nobody pays any attention to, which does tend to happen, by the way, towards the end of the nomination season where people stop voting, people stop covering it, people stop doing exit polls, which breaks my heart. I'm sure it breaks Bill's heart and everybody else's. But what might we see down the road before we get to the conventions that will give us some more to chew on? Why don't we start with Chris, and we'll go to Chris and Gabe and Bill. Now you're muted.
I'm going to give I'm going to dodge a little bit on this one, and I'm going to say, I think from a kind of news and what's interesting perspective, we're really going to start to see a lot of attention on, the Trump VP pick and sort of where does this go next for folks? What is the next story here? But if I were to look, if we were to try to drill down into some of these numbers, in these next upcoming states to try to figure out, whether there's clues there. I think we'll continue to really look at Trump's numbers in the suburbs. That's one that has been, there's been some mixed messages out of those numbers in some of these contested primaries and even caucuses so far. And that will be a big one. And then, around the vote share around some of these college campuses when it comes to younger folks, whether they are coming on for Biden, like you mentioned, this uncommitted vote, and whether that continues to pick up any momentum. The big question on that, of course, is how many of these folks are really trying to send a message to the White House, send a message to Biden, but then come home in the end anyway. And also, how does that situation potentially resolve itself in the next number of weeks? We're looking at it in terms of how will Israel and Palestine play in a general election. And it's possible that in the next month or even in the next few weeks that we see some real movement there. At least that's been discussed by the administration and seems to be at least an expectation right now. And so those are the probably the main things we're looking at here, but attention is really going to shift to this general election. It already, frankly, has, as Bill mentioned. I mean, Biden has put out probably 3 statements after the conclusion of primaries so far, basically repivoting to the general election and Trump, and then we've been sort of sidetracked each time by some of the Haley news and her sort of haymakers at Trump, and Democrats were entertained by it, and some Republicans wanted it to keep going. But this primary and nomination, frankly, has been basically over and kind of an academic exercise for some time now. And so, we can basically move on and try to read the tea leaves and focus on who Trump is going to pick as his vice presidential nominee.
Hey, Gabe, I'm wondering if you could answer this, but also focus a little bit on the Latino turnout. I mean, we had the 2 big Latino states, Texas and California, on Super Tuesday. What do you take away from that, if anything?
Yeah, real briefly, I think I agree with Christopher, in terms of what to expect moving forward. With Haley's big announcement, that takes a lot of the fire out of the speculation we could all make about future states on the primary side. But I always like to remind folks that whenever we're talking about the primary season, it's very hard in general to make generalizations because the electorate is so much different. Once we get to the general election, turnout is higher, young voters, basically all the non-highly partisan folks become much more relevant. So I think moving forward, a lot of it will be the ability for both campaigns to analyze any weak spots in their base, because at the end of the day, this is really about the basis of both camps. And so down the stretch, they'll be able to look at weak spots. Do they see any areas where they need to invest more resources to increase turnout? Those kind of things I think are incredibly valuable for both campaigns. They just don't provide as much, I guess, public consumption-oriented news. I think is the way that I'd agree with Christopher on how much there'll be for us to speculate on. So that's my 2 cents there. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Latinos. That's my area of specialization. And just like we've seen the last few election cycles, ton of speculation, just like we saw during the 2022 election, that Latinos, right, would be moving to the right, are continuing to move to the right, and there's a lot of speculation that Trump consequently could improve his vote share among Latinos in 2024, which would obviously be huge for the Trump campaign, right? If they're able to actually improve on their standing with Latinos from what they did 4 years ago. Now, just taking a look, and again, California and Texas are the two big states. They comprise roughly half of the full Latino population in the U.S. reside just in those two states. So it's fortunate for us that we're in Super Tuesday. I'll look to Texas for an example of what I think provides a sliver of good news for Biden with Latino voters. My colleague Michael Rios out of UCLA's Voting Rights Center that they have over there at UCLA put out some analysis of voting precinct data early this morning in South Texas, which showed that heavily Hispanic precincts actually improved their performance with Biden relative to back in the 2020 primary, excuse me. That's a big deal because if folks paid close attention to South Texas, this was an important narrative for Republicans and Trump after 2020 and 2022, which was an area that they really invested a lot of energy in, put some Republican precinct housing kind of location offices in South Texas, really garnered heavy. And their performance with South Texas Latino voters was one of the big talking points that to them indicated they have an opportunity to really galvanize more of the Latino vote moving forward. So the fact that Biden showed improvements in performance in those heavily Hispanic precincts, some of those South Texas precincts are like 90% Latino. So it really is an important place for us to look at. We're important. Other thing I'll say briefly is if we look closely at the exit poll data, I think that also sheds some light on the important role that immigration will play in this race. As I've been writing about pretty extensively for Brookings over the last couple of years, I've noted that unlike 2020 and 2022, when immigration really dropped in issue salience, not only among Latino voters, but voters overall nationally, we're seeing evidence in the exit polls that immigration is a top priority for not only Latino voters, but voters overall across a lot of these states, even in some cases outpacing abortion in issue saliency. What that means, at least my perspective on the analysis that I've been doing over the years, is that when immigration is a top priority for Latino voters, this generally translates into higher Democratic vote share. And this is particularly the case if we see inflammatory language about immigrants and the extension of immigrants to Latinos from Trump. So if we do see evidence of Trump really villainizing immigrants, and often his messaging carries over into not just immigrants, but Latinos or Mexicans specifically, I think this bodes very well for the Biden campaign because the evidence has consistently shown when that happens, Latinos' enthusiasm goes up and their support for Democrats goes up as well. However, I'll close with the exit poll data and some polling that has been credible of Latino voters has some sunshine for the Trump campaign. And that's because on some big surveys, the Unidos poll, for example, had a very large sample size of Latino voters. They asked individuals, if you've identified immigration as your top priority, tell us in your own words what that means. And when you look at that follow-up data, there's actually a pretty good balance among Latino voters of folks who say path to citizenship, which obviously bodes well for Biden, versus border control and border security, which bodes a little bit better for Trump. So I think that little bit of a mixed bag of where we are now sends some signals to both sides that they have some opportunities to really court the Latino vote, specifically on immigration.
That's fascinating, Gabe, especially the South Texas precincts, because after all, this was not a contested primary. It wasn't right. The outcome was known. It wasn't like there was a big battle between Biden and somebody else and that would serve to increase turnout. So that's pretty interesting. Bill.
Yeah, that's the first thing I woke up to this morning. Thought it was maybe the most interesting thing I've seen so far in the numbers.
Yeah. Bill?
But obviously this state is hard. Yeah, there was actually a big contested congressional primary down in South Texas, though, with Gonzalez, right? So that could have gotten voters out. And this is where you can, it is a little hard to go from the primary to the general for many reasons. One of them is that you get a contested congressional race or Senate race, like we'll have in Ohio. You get a big turnout. What does it tell you? It just tells you that voters in Ohio are going to vote because they're voting on the same day for their Senate primary, I believe, whereas voters in some other state don't have any, the presidential race is done and they don't have a contested Senate or gubernatorial or even congressional races, and they stay home. So it's a little hard to know what to say, I think, about the turnout thing, though I generally think Yeah, that I mean, a lot hinges ultimately on is this 2016 or is this 2020? And 2016 was a medium turnout, let's call it old-fashioned turnout election, uh, and a fair number of votes for third, fourth, and fifth parties. What it ended up being like 6, 7%, I think, going on. 5, 6% at least. 2020 had a huge surge. People really have not internalized this fact. I think we went up 20% in turnout from 16 to 20. That does not happen in America. In America, the changes are usually like 2% from one cycle to another. And of course, 18 had a huge surge in the off year, which was carried through in 2022. So we have had 3 straight very high turnout elections. Will the rerun of of Trump and Biden be such generate that kind of enthusiasm among infrequent and less informed voters or not? And which voters stay home? And you could argue this one either way. The new current wisdom, I would say, is that the less informed voters maybe are Democratic. That the Democrats benefit from a high turnout. They did well in 2018 and 2022. Get all those young voters out. The old-fashioned wisdom was that it was the Trump Republicans who were the less informed, less frequent voters, and Trump mobilized them. I don't know, to establish Republicans stay home, the young voters who were on the left stay home. So I think the turnout question of whether it's symmetrical or asymmetric is going to be very interesting for the campaigns to think about and for observers, obviously, to try to figure out. But I don't know how much guidance we'll get from the primaries, except we will get some sense in general, I suppose, of how much interest there is. And you can compare turnout in the later states when the race was already resolved in the past to turnout in the later states when the race is resolved, now, I suppose. But there's always some surprise. So just to come back to very briefly to the one thing you mentioned right earlier, like, I would say now, if I were in one of these campaigns, I would put North Carolina in as much and make it as much of a priority and make it as much of a question, state that's in play, almost as much at least, as the classic swing states. The margin, and people somehow, because North Carolina has been Republican since Obama, since 08, and therefore Obama won it right by a point or something. I mean, we don't think of it as a swing state. It didn't go back. It wasn't one of the 5 states that went back and forth from 2016 to 20. That flipped from 2016 to 2020. The actual margin in North Carolina is 74,000 votes in 2020. That's half the margin of Michigan. If you just came down from Mars and someone said, which of these 2 states is more likely to flip, you could easily say North Carolina than Michigan. And Haley got 275 or something like 1,000 votes in North Carolina, and Trump's margin was 75,000. So I think one thing that will happen is that we're all used to talking about 6, maybe 7 swing states, New Hampshire or something like that. But I think North Carolina is going to be way up there as a real contested state. And that's something we sort of learned from and because of Robinson, this very far right extreme governor candidate, who's the type who hurts, we found in some of our efforts in 2022, who hurts Republicans. It's a little like Mastriano in Pennsylvania or Kerry Lake in Arizona. And if you put that together with the fact that the state's trending a little bit Democratic anyway, I don't know. If I were in the Biden campaign, I'd think a lot about investing a lot. I would say analytically, I would put more money on Biden winning North Carolina than Georgia right now. So Georgia has a sane Republican Party. If you're okay with Brian Kemp, you tell yourself that they'll keep Trump in line. Whatever you tell yourself, you know what I mean. You don't like Fani Willis and all this, kind of wackiness there at what's going on in Fulton County. I mean, it's pretty easy if you're a moderate conservative suburban Republican in Georgia to come back to the Republican fold. Whereas I say in North Carolina, it's the opposite. You look at Robinson, and you think this is nuts. So that's like one of these random things that's happened over the last couple of 2, 3, 4 weeks that I think actually is pretty interesting if you're into campaigns. And then no one particularly expected. But I think the turnout. So that's one state issue, but the broader turnout issue and the asymmetric implications of lower turnout. Who is turning out lower? We say small numbers, 8%, 9%, 11%. That's a lot. 8% of even one party is 4% of the electorate. If 4% of the electorate goes away from one party or for one candidate in some of these states, it's massive, right? Or even if that 4% goes 3 to 1 instead of 4 to 0, right? For the, so I mean, the degree to which even these things on the margin in such a polarized and closely divided electorate, at least in the closely divided states, can make a huge difference. I think the Biden, I've been a discounter, like I think pretty much all of 3 of you, of the ultimate importance of this uncommitted vote. It's such an easy thing to do. You're not hurting Biden. You're not helping Trump. You're just expressing an opinion or making a gesture. I don't minimize it in that way. It's a legitimate thing to do. It's just not, doesn't really tell you what you're going to do in November. But things could go in a direction where people feel even more strongly about this. And I don't know, look at 2016. That's why it could be 2016,
It could
right?
be 2016.
The uncommitted
Let
vote
me,
could be the Jill Stein vote of 2020.
let me add a little factoid about North Carolina that I heard last night, which also surprised me, which is there's the big division in the American population now is between college educated and non-college educated. If you're college educated, you're going to tend to vote Democratic. Non-college, you'll tend to vote Republican or for Trump. And one of the commentators mentioned that North Carolina has the biggest increase in college educated people of all the states. And of course, driven by that Raleigh-Durham research triangle where there's so much science and pharmaceutical industry going on. So that, if we put this in our little North Carolina discussion here, I think we've just got a new state to add to the Arizonas and the Michigans and the Pennsylvanias in terms of looking at 2024. We're about time for audience questions. So I'm encouraging the audience to please send your questions in. But I want to ask one thing before we get to audience questions, which is, given what you've seen, and given that the State of the Union in a presidential election year is almost always a preview of how the incumbent president is going to run, what do you think the most important thing Joe Biden has to do on Thursday night? Gabe, we'll go to Gabe and Chris and then Bill.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I guess the obvious is be present and look presidential. I mean, the American public has not seen the president in a live primetime showing in quite some time, right? Did not participate in what has become a traditional, even the Super Bowl kind of opportunity. So I think a lot of it is, especially with these questions about his age and all these other dimensions, that is really about, borderline age discrimination, just how live and viable he looks, especially in the context of a lot of the exit poll data, continuing to raise questions about, his just overall capacities. I think that's probably going to be the most powerful indicator. That's much less about what he has to say and much more about just the visual optics, right? I think that, to me, is what I'll be paying attention to. Substantively, right, a whole bunch of the issues we've talked about. Name, your population that he might have some challenges with in terms of enthusiasm. Is it going to be Gaza? Is it going to be immigration and really showing that nuance of border enforcement, but also some compassionate language about immigrants and immigration? One thing we really haven't talked about is Dobbs and abortion, right? I mean, the enthusiasm, at least our polling data strongly suggested a lot of the enthusiasm and turnout in 2022 was compliments of the Supreme Court and frustration and anger about the court. How is that going to play out, and will the president, step into that? So that's my quick thought on that. It's really, to me, going to be much more about imaging than it is going to be about anything that actually comes out of the president's mouth on that.
Chris?
Yeah, I think it's a real opportunity for him not just to speak to the country as a whole. We know he obviously passed up a big opportunity to address the country in the Super Bowl interview, and there have been a number of more sort of prime time venues that they pass up. There's obviously the news conferences that they do far fewer of. And so there's that element. But the kind of speaking to the base of the party now that we have this matchup set is going to be there for him, and stressing these things that he's done. I know there's a lot of frustration that talking about the kind of laundry list of accomplishments hasn't necessarily broken through with the public. There's still a lot more opportunity to lean into that. They obviously feel like he has a record that would be the envy of a lot of folks running for a second term. And so there's, a high profile way to do that. I also think that we all kind of think over and over, the bar has been set pretty low for Biden in these big performative moments. And having watched many of these come and go, he does generally seem to clear that bar, and in some cases very easily. And so there's always this tension and buildup around whether whether Biden will meet the moment, so to speak. He's had some good speeches in the same venue before, and so I think the sort of thought that can he clear that bar again is probably a little bit of overthinking on that. Once he sort of gets in the zone, he tends to clear it, and so it's the thing to watch. It's coming up, but we doubtfully will be talking about this on Monday, not to diminish the union. But yeah, it's probably works in his favor that people genuinely question, can Biden get through a 60-minute speech? And the answer is yes. We've seen him do it many times, and he'll do it again. So
I will interject here a surreal experience I had 3 weeks ago, which is at the Democratic House retreat. Biden came and I was 20 feet away from him, and members of Congress were asking him questions, and he was lucid and funny and what not in the least bit senile or demented. And as he was speaking, people started to look at their phones. The news was coming across, and the her report was coming across, said he was an old man and he was slow, etc. And it was a kind of a surreal experience, because there he was, not being a very old man, and there was the news we were getting saying just the opposite. So yeah, you're right, the bar is low for him. Bill.
Yeah, I mean, Her is going to testify to Congress on Tuesday, I think, right, on the 12th, and that could actually be more important. I mean, if he's credible and, people think, oh, look, he was just telling what he saw, and maybe it's different from what you saw, but people could behave differently on different days, or maybe he was kind of a partisan guy, Democrats trying to make this point. That would be a sort of an interest. So it's a pretty big week between Super Tuesday, the State of the Union, first testimony next Tuesday, and various other things. Government shutdown, non-shutdown, Ukraine aid. I mean, things are a lot of moving parts. It's always hard to predict which one makes a difference. I would just say, I was talking with someone today about he gets no credit for the economy, which has been good. Inflation's coming down. And I was thinking back to Reagan, closest to Reagan and Clinton, I would say. They had narratives about the economy, why they were going to do what they were going to do. Clinton had the budget deal in '95 in particular. Reagan had obviously tax cuts. And, things didn't go great for all of their first terms, but people kind of understood they had a view, a vision, an agenda. And when things started to turn up, as they did basically in '96 for Clinton and very much in '84 for Reagan, people were sort of saying, oh, okay, I guess maybe his theory was right. He had these policies and now things are getting better, so we'll reelect him. And that's kind of how, and even Obama had some of that, I would say, in 2012. They didn't do as good a job of selling it, but he came in and the economy was falling off the cliff. And he and Geithner and Summers and everyone said, we're going to be able to stabilize this. And by 2012, it wasn't great, but it was good enough. Biden has he's done a lot. And I would argue he's done a pretty good job on a lot of these things. And he has a very good Treasury Secretary, I think, Janet Yellen and so forth. But they have there's no big narrative, or at least it's not very evident. And I don't know if maybe it's a little late actually to do it now. But I think if you don't have a narrative, you're just at the mercy of events. If you don't have a narrative, gas prices go up 30 cents because of some freakish stuff going on somewhere in the world, or eggs or have some virus or something, and they went up, doubled in price, and everyone, oh my God, and you need to have that to overcome the kind of randomness of events. I think he has a little more of that in foreign policy, actually, but so I don't know whether he can lay that out. I mean, he can do it on the democracy stuff, I think, and on the foreign policy, Putin and NATO kind of side of things. It would help him a little bit, I think, if he had a New Deal, Great Society. Bidenomics is not a substitute for that. I mean, that's putting the president's name on a thing. That's not, or Clinton. Centrist, welfare reform. I mean, there are things that people were Bush, on the foreign policy side, or compassionate conservatism. I'm not saying it's a slogan exactly, but I think it would help him if he could give people something a little more to hang on to if there's some hiccup sometime in the campaign, or if he does, slip somewhere and stumble for two seconds and kind of overcome that kind of problem.
Good. Listen, we've got a couple minutes left, and there's two very good audience questions that have come in. So rather than do them sequentially, I'm going to do them all at once, and you can answer both or answer one or whatever. One of our audience members said, how many independents switched from Democrat to Republican to vote against Trump? I think that's a very interesting question. And the second interesting question came in is, if Trump is convicted with a criminal charge, what is the likely impact on his popularity? So, Bill, why don't we start with you and go to Gabe and Christopher?
I think Trump is unlikely to be convicted on one of the criminal charges, the two federal ones, that really could make a difference. And even if he's convicted in New York, it'll be a misdemeanor, maybe it'll be bumped to a felony. This complicated argument the district attorney there has made. He'll appeal, and it was about something that happened in 2016 and not fully correctly disclosing a certain payment. It's not even income, it's not tax fraud, it's like, election fraud, I guess you'd say, or not disclosing something you should have. So I don't think that makes, I think the courts could have made a difference, but I don't think I think it's very unlikely that they will at this point. On the other, what was the other question?
How many independents switched from Democrat?
It differs a lot from state to state, because obviously New Hampshire, Virginia have full ability to vote in the other. In Virginia, I walked in yesterday morning and they said, register, they checked who I was. We had photo ID, that was fine, driver's license. And then it was, do you want Mr. Crystal, do you want a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot? There's no party registration. You don't have to even nominally re-register. The only thing you're disqualified from doing is obviously voting in the primary of the other party on the same day. But I can go in June and having requested a Republican ballot for Haley, I can go in June and vote in the Democratic primary for House of Representatives. So it doesn't even last. For some states, it lasts for a year that you're in that party or something. But other states have much more restrictive partisan primaries. So it's hard to generalize. It's pretty clear that in New Hampshire, South Carolina, which is open, Virginia, there was a non-trivial number of Democrats who went over to Haley, but it's always harder than you think. And some Democratic-leaning independents. Independence is a funny category, as you know, because it's got basically Democratic voters in it, Republican voters in it, and true independents in it. Anyway, I think the Haley number is a little bigger than it looked. When people say Haley got 25% of the vote, roughly, in all the Republican primaries, all in, and that means there's a quarter of the Republicans who are, anti-Trump. That's high. It's probably more like 20%, 21. It's not, but the number of Democrats is not a majority of the Haley voters. And so those are genuine Republican or Republican-oriented voters, some number of whom must have voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020, just by the mathematics. Maybe half of them. I guess one poll showed half of the Haley voters were Biden voters, basically. And then, so the question, one way to think about the question is, can Biden hold the never Trump Republicans who already voted for him in 2020? And that's one reason he won, right? So as opposed to 2016. And then can he win over maybe a few more post January 6th and so forth? And then how much motion is there the other way? We're seeing this in some of the focus groups that my colleague Sarah Longo does. There's some Biden voters in 2020 when he was a challenger and there was chaos and the pandemic. He was a more attractive candidate to these people now that he's got the burdens of fears of incumbency. Anti-incumbency is pretty strong. So anyway, long way of saying that I think it's hard to get a real number on that. It differs from state to state. It's enough to change the election one way or the other in terms of the independents and the swingish voters in the key states.
Good. Gabe?
Yeah, I think Bill said it really well. I mean, it's hard to put a kind of finite number because so much of that was the Haley effect, right? And how much of that was specific to her role in the campaign. But it's a non-trivial number, right? I think the harder thing is, to speculate, well, what does that mean for the general election? I think I'm with Bill. These are folks that, probably Biden would capture anyway. So is this an indicator of enthusiasm? What does it tell us? That's a little bit harder to speculate on, and I won't put my neck out there too far without having any hard data to make some observations about. I think the question, is an interesting one about the criminal charges. I agree with Bill. There's not a high likelihood of conviction, but I think the question was, what impact, if that did occur, would that have on his popularity? And I think it's super surprising that, like most experts that I talk to, not a whole lot. When you think about it, with the number of charges that have been brought against the former president continuing to increase, and so much of those issues, right, having some semblance on what we usually refer to as how, quote unquote, presidential is a candidate, it's surprising that hasn't moved the needle nearly as much as a lot of us would expect that it would. And I think part of that is, at this point, right, with a showdown of a rematch of a last election, how many voters are out there that don't already have a strong opinion one way or the other? about former President Trump, where this would make a sizable shift in their views, right? Similar to what we talked about in terms of a crossover vote. I think there's enough there to make a potential difference. But at the end of the day, you know, it's surprising to a lot of us that just the speculation, the charges themselves haven't made a big impact. And because of that, I wouldn't expect it to move a whole lot, you know, moving forward to November.
And even when Mitch McConnell, who hasn't talked to Trump in 3 years, when Mitch McConnell decides to go ahead and endorse Trump, you got to wonder if anything changed, if anything will change anything. Christopher, you get the last word.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, this question is asked pretty frequently in exit polls. We've seen a number of big name Republicans out there ask this question themselves about whether they would still support Trump. And all the data we've seen out there suggests that a large number of Trump voters in these primaries and caucuses would continue to stick with him, even if he was a convicted felon. And what that would mean about all the other folks who are on the fence that we've just spent the last hour talking about, certainly that could have a huge impact on him. But if we're just talking about the folks who have answered that question, it seems to be a pretty resounding yes, that they would stick with him. And so, but again, probably academic, because the meaningful cases out there where he can be convicted don't at the moment appear to be moving forward before November. So it probably won't get an answer.
And then the other question was, how many Democrats do you think were in that Haley vote?
It seems like quite a few. I mean, there are a number of people who the Democrats were concerned enough about this happening that there were entire campaigns. One I'm thinking about on the ground when I was in South Carolina, the chair of the party, a number of elected officials, folks who parachuted from out of town, would come in and basically have a whole 5-minute opening saying, we know you want to go in there and send a message. You may even like Nikki Haley because she was their governor, but please vote Democratic. And a lot of that was about trying to, on the first try as the sort of first in the nation state, and having, as you know so well, moved up the state to try to have the best showing possible for Biden and try to rally Democrats and coalesce them behind him. But it was a concern enough that Democrats were certainly sounding the whistle about not crossing over. And again, where they go in the general, another question. But it seemed like a not insignificant number in these primaries we've had so far.
And on that note, let me thank Christopher, let me thank Gabe, let me thank Bill. This was a great discussion. There's a lot of unknowns, but hopefully we've given people a framework for thinking about what this means going forward. And I'm sure we will be coming to you again, and hopefully some of our guests, Gabe has to come with us. He works for Brookings, but I'm hoping that Bill, you and Christopher will join us again as we move through this election year. Many thanks.
Thanks.